What's going on, everybody? Welcome to this week's Lumix Live. We've got a kind of more in-depth going through the camera system stream for everyone set up today. So there's going to be a lot of checking out the menus and going through various settings. As the title, kind of says, we're talking about exposure tools. And we're going to go everything from the photography side of what kind of tools you have for getting exposure, and then into the video side of it. So we'll kind of split this up into two sections here. We're going to do photo first because it's a little bit easier and faster to talk about the photo stuff, and then we'll jump into the video side. But throughout the entire broadcast for today, if you have questions, make sure to tag at Lumix USA. As you can see, a couple people are doing. It helps me see the questions, and then we can go through and adjust and answer some of those while we go through this particular stream. If this is your first time joining Lumix Live, these are broadcasts that we do weekly every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where we talk about products, we talk about techniques, technologies. Every once in a while we'll have a guest on, like we did last week with Stephen Maddow, talking about the Eclipse. And yeah, it's designed so that you have a touch point with the Lumix brand and the opportunity to actually be able to ask us questions and get answers from the brand and not have to deal with questions or answers that may or may not be true coming from the various different social platforms. But before we dive into the camera and kind of going further into the conversations, I want to remind everybody in the US about Lumix Pro services. We have the red and the platinum tiers available. If you've just purchased the Lumix camera, make sure to get yourself registered for at least the red tier because it's free. You can either follow the QR code on the screen, or you can follow the link down in the description. If you're someone who likes a little bit higher level of service and support on the back end of the purchase that you make, you could always take a look at the Platinum tier. That's going to get you the 3-year extended warranty, which comes with the red tier as well. But on top of that, you're also going to get things like next day shipping and next day shipping with 2 days for service time. If you have to send a product in for repair, you get 20% off out of warranty repairs. So if you drop or break a lens or camera or something like that, you get a discount off the repair for those. And then you also get access to our membership hotline, which is open 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, so during the week, as well as like annual sensor cleanings, EVF cleanings, lens calibrations, firmware updates if you'd rather us do them instead of you going through the process. So it becomes a really nice program for those that are kind of really hard on your gear or really kind of dependent on your gear throughout the year if you're someone who works in seasonal types of photography and videography work. So yeah, definitely check that out. Link down in the description, but then we also have those QR codes. I'll try to remember to put them up at the end of the stream as well. So as we said, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. We're going to go through a couple of the ones first, and then we'll dive right into the demos for today. Any way to combine the multiple exposures from bracketing in camera on the G9 II? Also, where has 4K live crop gone to? So there is no in-camera stacking or combining of multiple exposures on the current line of cameras. We did used to have multi-exposure in previous gen cameras. I don't know if that's something that's coming forward yet. When we made the transition to the newer engine that we're using, basically in all of the cameras that support our phase hybrid autofocusing system, certain things were not ported over into the new system yet. But even at that point, I don't know if they're coming, if they're compatible, if they have to be rewritten to work on the new engine. But it is something that we hear often, wanting to see multiple exposures come back. So that is something that we've pressed up through the team. Now, as far as things like live cropping, live cropping traditionally has always been a feature that's been carried on like the GH line of cameras, so the much more video-centric line, as well as some of the higher-end S-series cameras, so a lot of the S5 2X, things like that. So as far as the G9 Mark II getting it, I don't believe the G9 Mark II will be getting the 4K live cropping, but it is something that as we get asked about it, we can feed it up through to the engineering team to see if it is something that could eventually maybe make its way to the camera, but I can't make any promises with certain features like that. knowing that the G9 Mark II out of the gate is the photography-focused camera in the Micro Four Thirds line, so the G9 series has always been way more photo-focused. Yes, they have a lot of video functionality, and yes, we do always tend to include a lot more video functionality in our cameras. There are typically still just certain things that are saved and reserved for the GH line. But yeah, it's kind of where that stuff is right now. Might be asking in vain, but is there any chance to get false color as it is a standard exposure tool? So false color comes up a lot, even internally with Matt Fraser and I. We push for false color into the cameras almost anytime we get an opportunity to really kind of collaborate and work with our engineering team. As far as likelihood of it being added into the cameras, I honestly don't have enough information now to be able to tell you yes or no, other than it is something that we are constantly pushing for. My understanding is there are a couple different variants of false color and the ways to implement it. So even if it were something we were going to implement, that's one of those things that has to go through a pretty rigorous process to make sure that, okay, if we were going to add feature A, B, or C, one, how does it impact the system? Is it possible to work with? Those are usually the base things that get tested first. And then it goes into, okay, well, how does it work on the camera? How does it want to be deployed if it's chosen to be something that gets added? But the more information that we hear from you guys, the more you kind of bring it up, the easier it is for Matt and I to work with our team and be like, hey, look, this is something that's really being asked for. What are the likelihoods of these kinds of things being added? So at the moment, I don't know if it's going to be added, but know that you've got a lot of support from people like Matt and myself to try to get it done and see if we can get it added into the cameras. So let's see. Paul says, I second in-camera focus stacking. Would also like to be raw files and with flash in electronic shutter. So yeah, we've asked about it. Like I said initially, like we've had in-camera like multi-exposure. It's not focus stacking. We've had multi-exposure in previous gen cameras. Focus stacking isn't something that we've done outside of like the 4K post-focus functionality, which was the video stream that was doing that. So I'm not sure if that's something that's going to be included in the cameras. But as far as things like flash with electronic shutter, the vast majority of times, I think something that should be kept in the back of your mind with using flash with electronic shutter. Until you move to a camera that has like global shutter, which we know is in the market now. But they come at a much higher price point because that technology is still very expensive to implement. Flash with electronic shutter is highly dependent and almost pretty much solely dependent on the readout speed of the sensor in its full area. So it's going to depend on what kind of shutter speeds you can get, what millisecond readout the entire sensor can read out at, and what that flash sync would be. Realistically, I don't think anyone would accept a 24th of a second or 25th of a second like flash sync speed. 60th tends to be when you read online that's kind of pushing it. Most people are expecting and desiring something like 250th or faster as what you would accept as flash firing speed with sync speed. So all of those components get brought into the conversation when you start looking at flash sync speed and what is actually usable versus what is like, okay, it's a checkbox off a spec list. Typically when we deploy various different kind of functions like that, we're doing a ton of research before even kind of broaching the subject of like, hey, maybe is this something that we think we can add? Because if it's going to get added, it has to be in what is like the expected use for it, right? It needs to hit certain criteria with internal targets as far as usability, quality of performance that you get out of the camera when you use things in those modes, and then also making sure that there are proper tools that work with a particular mode, in this case, flash. So not saying that it will never happen, but at the moment, my understanding is that it's not something that we're looking at because it hasn't breached that kind of target that we've considered yet for what would be a good deployment of something like that. And also, it also ties to, like I said, it also ties for what hardware can do. Sensors have to read out fast enough to be able to support it into that, kind of proper range for what we would want to deploy it with. So, yeah, hopefully that clears up a little bit for you. Confused between getting the 24-105 versus the Sigma 24-70 for the S5 IIX. Equally interested in doing photo and video. Which one's got the edge? I saw a lot of videos, but want your opinion. Well, I definitely appreciate that you want my opinion on this. So, you have pros and cons for both, right? 24-105, it's an f4 fixed lens throughout the range, versus the 24-70, which is an f2.8 throughout the range. So, okay, you've got, that section there. 24-105, obviously, and I'm going through the basic stuff first for how I typically address this when someone asks me. 24-105, yes, you have more range. 24-70, less range. So they're kind of evened out at that point now. What's really going to come into play, in my opinion, between those two lenses, because I've owned both of those lenses, is that the 24-105 will take full advantage of the functionality that you get in the LUMIX cameras. And what do I mean by that? It's things like you have full control over linear manual focus if you want to flip in and utilize manual focus. The Sigma lens, while it does support some linear manual focus, there are some limitations in the range that you can use. So the actual programming in how far the throw is in manual focus. That's more down to the motors that are chosen and the resolution of the sensors that are used for reading positioning information. So you're going to get a better experience on the LUMIX lens. You also get a better experience on the LUMIX 24-105 because that lens is also electronically parfocal. And what we mean by that is that if you zoom the lens out to 105, manually set your focus, and then zoom back to 24 in this case, the lens is going to actually be able to communicate with the camera, and it will maintain focus through the zoom range. So if you're using it in a video sense where you want to be able to do like, you're not letting autofocus control things for you, our lens is going to have the advantage there. You also have the kind of the more intangibles between the two. You've got things like the color rendition, the micro contrast, the sharpness between the two lenses, and that's the kind of stuff that, if that's what the level is that you're starting to look at between the two, that's where I highly recommend trying to rent them if possible. Do a couple of things to check and things like that. So it's, in my opinion, I personally prefer using the 24-105, even though it's an f4, over the 24-70. Yes, the 24-70 was a really nice lens, and they do make the smaller 28-70. But having the advantages of things like that electronic parfocal, having the fact that it's, directly, one, it's built by us, so we know everything about it in and out. The LMAT Alliance does make those kinds of conversations not as big of a deal anymore because everyone's considered first party at that point. But most importantly, the range is what I tend to like more. It's actually why personally I've gotten a lot of time with the 28-200, the new one that we just released, because it's much more compact. Trade-off with this one being just that it's a much more variable aperture. It's a variable aperture lens, f4 to 7.1. So depending on the type of shooting you're doing, that's what I would say. I know that's not really a definitive. ISO performance, I don't think you have to worry about the stop difference between f2.8 and f4. If you want more subject isolation, the 24-105 lets you zoom in further, or zoom out further, zoom in further. That's the right way to put it. So you can work with compression better, and you can get the similar effect. You just have to shoot a little bit tighter. So that's where I kind of sit with them. 24-70 is a nice lens. Like I said, I've owned both of them. But I'll be honest, I got rid of my 24-70 from Sigma. I use ours because I like our in general much better. But the 24-105 and the new 28-200 are what typically are going on my camera when I need a zoom lens. Outside of that, everything's been pretty much prime lenses on my side, or fixed focal length lenses. Video, how do you recommend exposing when shooting vlog for Rec 2020, 2100 versus Rec 709? Any difference between exposing for HDR or SDR output? This is a really good point. So, actually, I'm going to flip what I said at the beginning. Let's talk about the video exposure tools first. So, when we talk about utilizing vlog, right, there are many reasons why, you know, someone would want to shoot vlog, and this is probably one of the bigger, you know, comments here, right? I'm shooting for HDR export. I'm shooting for like 709 export. Now, the part that I would say is probably the hardest to understand, or it takes the most time to like kind of switch your brain a little bit for thinking, is that you're not exposing differently between like 709 and Rec 2020 or Rec 2100 in a general sense. What you're doing is looking at how bright your highlights really can be and where you want that positioning information to go. Because if you're recording in vlog and on the, you know, say like the S5 Mark IIX, right, you're going to get more than enough dynamic range to do an HDR output. You're getting 14 plus stops. So basically anything over, I believe it's like 9 stops, you're pretty much going to need to go to HDR to really be able to show all of it. But the way I advise exposing is within 2 main tools that we have. So the first one is the Luminance Spot Meter tool. The Luminance Spot Meter tool is a function that we've talked about a few times before. And let me just put this on a gray card so I can show you what the figures actually look like. Luminance Spot Meter is the tool that we have built into all of our newer cameras that allows you to take a target box, which you can see here, put it over your gray card. In this case, I'm using a color checker. Yes, it's a photo one, but the principle is the same. It lets you put that target over the object where you want your middle gray point to be. And if I come into the menus here and I change my color profile over to, if I change this over to Vlog, and then I believe I have a LUT over HDMI, so we're going to do this real quick. Yeah, we're going to turn this off real quick. Okay, so what this allows me to do is say, okay, I've got my setup here. I want to make sure that, one, Vlog is supposed to be exposed to 42%, 42 IRE is what your skin or your 18% gray is supposed to be exposed to. So if I come in and I adjust my exposure here, and I'm using the 10 to 25 f1.7 here, so that's why we have that smooth iris change there. So if I bring this down to 0 stops on this scale, what you'll see is that right now, that is rating my middle gray point at the proper 42 IRE. But if I'm exposing for HDR, it's not going to look that great. There's, you know, you're seeing some challenges here because everything's going to be kind of flat. This is where, you know, improving lighting can come in for things like this, because you want to work on your highlights, you want to work on your shadows. That's where you add, you know, your various different lighting situations to expand your dynamic range in the final result. Now, if I am doing this to where I want to make sure that I can get the brightest looking image, so I can maximize how much of the highlight range I can work with, this is where if I take this light in here now, and I use the Luminance Spot Meter and I move this onto the light area, you'll see that this is where I can come through and say, hey, I've got about 5.3, 5.4 stops over the middle gray, so over 42 IRE, that I can actually come in and make adjustments for. So this is called shooting to protect your highlights. That means that at that 5.5 stops, if I bring this down a little bit more, we get this to where it's not hitting right up against that 5.5. If I bring this to 5.4, if I just got to bring this down a little bit more, right there, 5.4, that means that within that block of right here, That means that I'm not losing the highlight information for that particular part of the image. This will allow me to go into post, and when I'm setting up my system for exporting in HDR, I know that the brightest part of my image, which is going to be like, 1,000 nits, right? If I want to do that for my white point, I know that I can make sure that my highlights go all the way up there, and that I have all this room in the shadow region to work with. So this will protect your highlights. The other way to do this is to take a look at Luminance Spot Meter and say, hey, okay, if I want to protect those highlights, it means that my shadows or my midtones are now 3 stops underexposed. And if you've shot in Vlog before or any kind of log profile, underexposing is not a good thing. You really want to try to not underexpose as much as you can. So if I shift my exposure again here, and we bring this to a better kind of exposure setup here. So if I bring this up to 0%, and then if I move my spot meter over here, you'll see that, like, for one, I'm well blown out in those highlights. Exposing to maximize your exposure one way or another is going to be the key to do it right in the camera to start with. If you're going to be exporting out in 709, you still want this exposure to be as good as you can. You want to balance and make sure that your highlights are protected and that your shadows aren't too buried down into the lowest ranges. So I'm able to then also take the Luminance Spot Meter, and I can come in and say, hey, what do we have in this shadowed region for IRE or for stop value? And it's under by 3.8. This lets me control the actual kind of stops of dynamic range that I'm going to get. It's easier to do it this way in the field, where you can pick and say, hey, I don't want to blow out the clouds in the sky over a particular image. Or if in general you want to protect a blue sky, you can then be able to sit there and go, hey, move the spot meter into the blue patch of sky. Make sure that it's somewhere up in that kind of range of like 5.4 stops. And this is on the G9 Mark II that I'm reading this. The other cameras can go 6.5 stops. So I can move the spot meter around. I can then put it back on my main subject here and say, hey, okay, I can afford to lift my midtones up a little bit. So if I move those up a stop, then you're also going to see again that stop difference will happen in the shadow region. So utilizing Luminance Spot Meter in the video side can be a huge game changer for being able to quickly adjust your settings and get your exposures properly set when you're in the field. The other option that's typically used is the waveform monitor. Now, waveform on our cameras doesn't output over HDMI, so unfortunately I don't have a setup that I can show you that right at the moment. Sorry about that. But what the waveform allows you to do is also kind of take into consideration where the bright highlight point is, or where the overexposed area is going to be when you're shooting in log. Because I can look at the waveform, look at the entire width of it, because it's going to be representative of the actual width of your frame. And as you look, and as that curve kind of goes up, or as that waveform moves up and down, you'll be able to see, like, hey, if I have like these really bright lights right here, you're going to see like the line will come across. It'll be relatively flat. You'll have some dips down here because of the shadowed region, but then you'll see a spike right here on that waveform, and it's going to correlate to where it is in the frame. That can be a good way to also tell, because as you move your exposure up and down through either iris or through ISO, you'll see that there will be certain points where maybe you can get those particular lights to not be clipping, so they drop down and then you see them moving. As you bring your exposure up, you'll see that they'll basically hit a wall and then they'll flatten out. So then every time you go brighter than that, you're just pushing those highlights further and further away, which means you're going to have to deal with more roll-off of your highlight. So that's another good tool to use with this. The most important thing, especially if you're going to be exposing for HDR, is make sure that you're giving yourself enough flexibility in the master file that you record. Try to get as much of the highlight range as you can. Try to not have your shadows buried too deep down into the underexposed portion, or under middle gray, or 18% gray. And you'll be able to have a good balance there. Now, the difference between that and 709 recording is really not that big of a difference there. If you are recording your file with the maximum amount of dynamic range and your master file is in log and you have it, you do your conform, you do your correction to like 709, and then you do your actual color grading on top of that. And you're going to be able to maintain all of that dynamic range for the most part. You have to compress it down into the like 709 color space, so you will notice that there are going to be certain things where highlights will clip faster than your shadow, or you start to compress everything. But tools that you use in post or your NLE that you use in post, a lot of them now are starting to have the flexibility to actually be able to work on a project and say, hey, I want to have it set to work for the work for HDR, but then also know that I'm going to need a 709 output or an SDR output, so that you can work with them correctly. If you've never done so and it's the first time you're working in HDR, I recommend trying out working in the hybrid log gamma profiles, and kind of understanding and starting to feel how the exposure works there. Hybrid log gamma, for those that don't know, is a color profile that actually intelligently allows, based on the information of communication from the display and the metadata in the image, if the display is HLG compatible, it will show you an HDR image. If the display is SDR compatible, it'll only show you SDR. And then we have tools built into the camera for the HLG View Assist, which is what allows you to come in here and say, hey, I want to have the screen show me what the bright portions are. So this is that kind of concept of I'm exposing for the highlight region to make sure that they're not overblown. Or you can set it to mode 2, which shows you the brightness levels for your midtones. So making sure skin tones are properly exposed. That means that your highlights have a bigger potential of blowing out your highlights in HDR. And your shadows are going to be, you're going to have to control your shadows a little bit there. But both of these options are great ways to get into working with HDR if you've never done it before. I also highly recommend reading up a lot on HDR and the general workflow. It's not just as simple as, hey, I'm going to export out in 2020 or 2100. You have to think about your color gamut and color space as well, so you want P3. You have to think about metadata for when you're going to put things like this on things like YouTube or Vimeo. How that file is handled when it's viewed on an SDR display versus an HDR display. There's a lot involved with it, but we give you the vast majority of the tools that can help you, at least in the capture portion, set your exposures right. If you're in a set scenario, that's where you're going to set your Luminance Spot Meter on your 18% gray to 42, and then use supplemental lighting to get the ratios that you need. If you're out in the field, that's where typically the general consensus is shoot to protect your highlights, and then you adjust your shadows there. That's a really long-winded way of talking about exposure there, but hopefully that some of that was helpful for you. And I knocked out 2 of the exposure tools for that conversation. Let's see here. Got a couple other questions that came in here. Cheeky question, I know, but I'll give it a go. With NAB in mind, what date, if any, should I block on my calendar under the header LUMIX? Well, we'll be at NAB for the entire show, so the whole show. Yeah, there's nothing that I have as far as NAB. We're going to be there. We'll have S52Xs, S52. We'll have the DJI gimbals and stuff there too. So if you're going to be in Las Vegas, definitely swing by. Matt Fraser, myself, and Neil Matsumoto will be there. We always love connecting with all of you when we see you in person. So definitely swing by. Let's see here. Let's see. Can Panasonic issue a chart of where G9 Mark II's DR boost cuts out for long exposure at each ISO? I have asked for one. I haven't seen one yet. So the GH6 didn't get live 4K live crop either. I would love to see that come back. Yeah, the GH6 I think is the sole exception that we've had in the lineup with that, but it's something we've asked to have brought back. So. Let's see. How usable or sharp is the APS-C mode in LUMIX cameras? The extra reach will make the 24-105 a 135, right? I tried hard to find any videos about this topic, but wasn't able to find any. So depending on the resolution combination that you're working with, the Super 35 or the APS-C crop modes when you're in video will determine what the punch-in is. Well, not really what the punch-in is. That's what pixel to pixel's for. APS-C on our cameras, when you record in that region, is still outside of the 4K 60p, is still going to use more resolution than what the 4K is, so you're still getting some downsampling there. Sharpness wise, I don't think you're going to notice any difference in sharpness. There are very slight differences in noise performance between Super 35 or APS-C and full frame use. And that just comes down to utilizing either a much larger canvas to downsample to 4K versus using slightly less resolution to downsample to 4K. When you get into the pixel-to-pixel crops, which really can extend your range depending on what resolution you're recording in. So if you're in 1080p and you do pixel-to-pixel, you're going to get a really heavy punch-in. That's where you'll see probably a little bit bigger of a difference, because pixel-to-pixel is literally you'll use either 3840 by 2160, 4096 by 2160, or 1920 by 1080 for it. That's where you'll see maybe a little bit of a difference. But sharpness, I mean, there are plenty of use cases and videos out there that utilize things like 4K 60, and footage is beautifully sharp. So, let's see here. Speaking of waveform monitor, any chance of an RGB waveform monitor, even if only on the video-centric higher level cameras like the next iteration of an S1H? That's one that I know's come up, but I haven't heard any major pushes behind things like an RGB parade in the cameras. The reality is that within the camera, there's a lot of back and forth, right, within the market, within users, within forums, within all the different ways that people use their cameras. You'll find equally the same number of people that say the tools that you put in the cameras are useless because it's a 3-inch touchscreen on the back. Those are typically users that will then say, like, hey, I want a 5-inch monitor on the back, or they're using an external monitor, which has all those tools in it. So, you have a solution for things like that. That's also one of the ways that you have solution for false color. But then on the other side, on the other hand, we have, a lot of situations like myself. The way I capture video is I love using the smaller screen. I don't want to put a monitor on top of the camera. But in reality, I also have never really used RGB Parade either for things like that. It's just a matter of figuring out what works best for you. As far as whether or not we would do something like RGB parades for that, a lot of it is probably going to be more down to what's priority. There's been a lot more people asking about things like false color, which is something that we've fed up to our team. And whatever gets the most priority is what gets worked on first. So as the cameras evolve, and I think this is probably the coolest thing about LUMIX cameras primarily, obviously because that's what I can speak of, but modern digital cameras, is that things typically can be firmware updated. Not everything, make that super clear, not everything can be added through firmware. There are also certain ways, certain requirements for things like waveform or vector scopes or parade or false color that can also be like engine dependent. Do you have enough engine horsepower in the camera processors to be able to do this stuff? I've said this before, a lot of people think it's very easy to just like slap a new firmware in there and cool, you're off to the races with new features. But it is definitely part of the conversation that you do also have limited or finite resources to work with in a camera. So in some cases, certain features that become more priority overtake those that are viewed as less priority, and then that results in those less priority features not being included anymore because more people want, X, Y, or Z with it. So, yeah. Let's see here. Is there reference material for video similar to Ansel Adams' series, The Camera, the Negative, and the Print? Not that I'm aware of. And the photography side gives you a ton of tools and things out there since it's been around a heck of a lot longer. But there are a number of talented color graders, or colorists, filmmakers, videographers out there that have incredible talent and really, awesome insight into how to work and expose with video. My biggest recommendation is to take multiple opinions when it comes to that kind of stuff, because exposing for photo and video are very subjective. Yes, there are certain guidelines that you're technically supposed to follow. And believe me, through my time of going to school for an art degree in photography, I was not necessarily one of my teacher's favorite students, because I was, always challenging. Well, just because you say this is how it should be, why does that make it fact? Same thing happens with the video side. Just because someone says X, Y, and Z doesn't mean that that's the only way to get to a result. So definitely take a lot of the information out there. Take a look at colorists, anyone that works in color grading. They make some really good content on exposure. So, let's see. I would like to see some in-depth treatment of the S5 remote control options for video recording, but also in conjunction with the streaming options. If you could elaborate on in-depth treatment, if you mean a video about it, we could look at that. Typically, when I've done those talk about Lumix Tether in the past and some of the control there, not many people have ever tuned into it, so that's why we haven't really done one in a while. Let's see. Chris, Evil 1 got an update. Yep, it did get a firmware update. Please discuss native ISO. Oh, wait. With OM systems using a full-frame Sigma lens, would Lumix consider releasing 4/3 mounts on any of the L-mount lenses? So to start with, there's speculation on that it's a Sigma lens. I don't think that is something that was ever confirmed, or even if it is using that, I don't think you'd ever get anyone to confirm that. Converting lenses that are from full frame to micro 4/3, you run into all kinds of crazy challenges there. Like, for one, L-mount lenses on micro 4/3 is theoretically, I gotta remember this, because the micro 4/3 mount is 19.75 millimeter. The L mount is 20 millimeter. Or millimeter is not centimeter. So in both cases, it's not possible. And I say it's not possible because, one, either there is no metallurgy that exists that would be strong enough for a 0.25 millimeter converter or mount adapter, end space for electronics. And then when you go the other way around, if you go micro 4/3 to full frame, the lenses would actually have to sit within the lens mount, which is just not possible right now. So yeah, that's why you won't see that kind of stuff, which is also why I argue that lens is not actually what people say it is. Okay. Please discuss native ISO values for Vlog and standard profiles for BGH1, GH52, BS1H, and S52X for cleanest image. Is there a chart somewhere? We don't have a chart, but the DP Journey on YouTube, so it's Sharif Mukbel, he did really nice charts that show you what the native ISO values are. Easiest way to tell, if you've got a Lumix camera that has control over the native ISO value changes. When you go into the menu, and actually, because I have a G9 Mark II up here, I can't do it. When you go into the menu and you select high ISO, go into your ISO value, depending on the color profile, you'll see that the lowest value changes. Now, the lowest value before you go to extended ISO is your native ISO for that color profile. When you go into the low range and manually select low for dual ISO range, the same thing applies. When you click in your ISO, the lowest number on that scale that's available without going into extended ranges, that is your native range. If you're looking to get the cleanest image, it's a bit of a loaded question. Because there's a difference between cleanest image and most dynamic range. Most dynamic range is typically going to come with a little more noise than what you would see to go for the absolute cleanest. The low extended range on cameras that allow you to go to a low extended range are doing a couple of different things, but primarily you are getting a cleaner image at the expense of your highlight dynamic range. So you're going to lose a little bit of dynamic range up here, but you're going to get a cleaner looking image. Where if you're using the native ISOs, which for Vlog across the cameras, if you're only focusing on Vlog, is going to be either 640 or 4000 on the full frame cameras. So that's the BS1H, S5 Mark II, S5 Mark IIX, the entire the S1. Was it the S1, S1H, and the S5? They all have that 640, 4000 for your Vlog. If you stick at those, you're going to get the best dynamic range that you can get out of the camera. You obviously have to light your scene to get the best. If you pull those ISOs down, you're going to lose highlight range, but you'll get a little bit cleaner looking footage. But then when you go to the Micro Four Thirds cameras, so the BGH1, that one I believe is 4000 and was it 4000 and 2500, I believe. I don't have one of those cameras on me to double check it, but you do the same process there. For the GH5 Mark II, we don't publish what the dynamic range or what the native ISO values are on that camera, because that's a single circuit ISO value that doesn't have the dual native ISO system there. Okay. So, want to jump back into this real quick and talk about a couple things that we just kind of like glossed over a little bit before. So, when it comes to exposing properly for, in this case, video functionality, you know, I had quickly run through Vlog View Assist. Now, Vlog View Assist, for anybody that's going to be recording in the Vlog color profile, if you've ever done it, you realize that, okay, hey, look, I've got this like super flat looking image. There's not, you know, there's no contrast. The color's really, you know, desaturated. And actually I can change this so that we can start showing the color desaturation there. So you'll see like, okay, cool. You can try to expose like this. I know this is how I prefer to shoot. I don't like applying a particular LUT over my footage because I know how to, you know, I use the tools in the camera to tell me where my exposures are. But if you want to be able to preview what the actual image is going to look like or very, very close to it with things like a Like 709 LUT applied, this is where we have the Vlog View Assist for getting your exposure. So here you have the option to select different LUTs that you would want to apply. This is going to be available on any of the cameras. This is separate from the real-time LUT functionality. But all the cameras that have Vlog also come with a Vlog to Like 709 default profile here. And then you have the ability to come into Vlog View Assist. And in this case, because I'm out over HDMI, I can apply that. And you see that that brings the color back. Now, this is going to just be a View Assist LUT. This is just going to help you determine and say, hey, as I'm looking at the image, this is much closer to what I'm going to see when I bring it into my software and I apply the Like 709 conversion to it. You are still recording the log footage. So if I come in and I turn this back off, again, this is what I'm actually recording with it. So I will still have to do that post-production to bring it back into 709 to do the general conversions there. What you'll notice is that you can use this as a general idea to determine that when I'm setting my exposure up in Like 709, if I know that 709 is my project and maybe I'm not shooting for HDR, right? I can use the Vlog View Assist to actually help me determine, okay, how bright do I need my highlights? How dark can I let my shadows go? Because it's going to give you a relative view for 709. Now, in reality, your log footage is going to have more flexibility than what you see in the Like 709 preview. So you know that you still have some flexibility there, but this gives you at least a quick visual for it. And on our cameras, you can either have it display on the display, so on the actual back of the camera. You can have it output over HDMI, as I'm doing now, or you can have it do both. So if you are using both an external monitor and the built-in monitor or the viewfinder, you can have it shown across the board. The thing to keep in mind is that if you are recording externally, you don't want to be sending the Leica 709 out over in View Assist, because that is baking that into that footage. If you're going to use an external monitor and you want to be able to preview the log footage as a, kind of like 709 or a Rec 2020 or HDR PQ or any of those, that's where you're going to want to use the monitor to apply the viewing assist for it. If you do it the other way and you send it from the camera, that footage is now permanently burned in as that profile that's being sent to the camera. Let's see here. The other question, any news on multicam over IP for BGH1 and BS1H, SRT or NDI? Unfortunately, I don't have any other updates on that one. Great things. If we are forced to use an external monitor to get these tools, can HDMI latency please be addressed? Pulling focus with that delay is nigh on impossible. I understand where you're coming from, but there are a couple things that you can do to address latency. If you turn audio off over HDMI, the latency is reduced. We do a pretty frame synced audio connection, where a lot of other times you can run into where you get lower latency, but your audio can be slightly off by a frame or so. But yeah, if you turn audio off over HDMI, the latency drops. And at that point, it kind of will also depend on which camera you're using. If you're using autofocus, then latency of a couple of frames isn't as big of a deal. That's a generalization. I'm not saying that it's not a big deal, but in general, my conversations with filmmakers is it hasn't really been an issue at that point, especially with the phase hybrid autofocus that we deploy now. So, yeah, it's kind of where that is. And yes, you've turned... Okay, I just saw that second part of your... yes, you've turned off audio on HDMI. Yeah, I mean, at that point, that's about as fast as you're going to get on the current ones there. Is there a way to disable lens profile corrections when shooting video on the S-Series? No, there is not. Technically, if you shoot and capture RAW over HDMI, you are bypassing the lens correction for some things. If you're using PL lenses, stuff like that. But if you're shooting internally, no, the lens profiles are there. You want them there. I understand there's a big movement of people saying that, you want to turn lens corrections off and gain back field of view, but that's not how it works these days. Lenses are designed and cameras are designed to run with corrections applied, so that you can get the best out of the product. But yeah, it's kind of how it is. Plus, can Lumix create a PL to L mount adapter? We don't have to. Sigma makes probably one of the best ones on the market. It's the MC31. On the newer cameras, so basically everything past the S1H and newer, the Sigma MC31 actually also has the accommodations for a set screw, a locking screw, to mount the MC31 to the L mount. It's part of the standard now. And that's carried on to all of the newer cameras since the S1H. So if you're looking for a solid PL to L mount adapter, MC31's the one you want to go with, at least in my opinion. There are others, like Wooden Camera I think makes one. There are definitely other options out there, but I'm a big proponent of the Sigma one. Can my new G9 Mark II display waveform in photo mode? This would be very useful, certain types of images, like mostly darkish performance. So this is actually a good segue to talk about the photo tools here. So yes, unfortunately, waveform is not something that is available in the photo modes. Now, I am in agreement. I would love to have waveform in stills recording. I have asked for it numerous times. I know Matt Fraser has asked for it numerous times. Waveform is so much more useful than histogram in many, many, many respects. But at the moment, no, the cameras don't allow for waveform in photo modes. That being said, what you have for those that are looking at this kind of information, What you do have is you do have histogram for setting it, which also, as I fumble through the menus here, just because I rarely use histogram. Yeah, here you go. So we do have histogram, which is something that if you've ever used a histogram before, the one thing to remember is that histograms are based off the JPEG. They are not based off the raw data that you're recording. So know that if I'm adjusting this exposure, say, and let's go into full manual so I can actually adjust this. So if I'm coming in here and I'm adjusting, and let me turn off auto ISO. If I am adjusting my exposure here, you'll see that I can bring my exposure value down to where the histogram goes yellow. Yellow indicates that the exposure is set properly, means that it's within range. And that will allow me to basically go in and say, hey, I'm not clipping anything in my highlights. As I go through, if I start to shift to make it super bright, and because I've got this over HDMI, the constant preview system's a little different. As you move through, you'll see that that histogram will shift and move. All that's telling you is luminance values. When it's all within there and you're not clipping anything out, then you know that, okay, yes, I've got enough flexibility in the raw file, but your JPEG is always going to be what you see is what you get, basically. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at the different kind of options for it. Other functions that you do have for making sure you get exposure right within the camera for photography-based modes is you do also have the option to shift what the exposure meter looks like. So I've gotten a lot of questions to say, like, how do I get my exposure meter to look like this, to where this is giving me what the correlations will be between exposure values. So if I am in, right now I'm in shutter priority. So if I know, like, hey, I want to be at a, let's say 30th of a second, you'll see in 30th of a second up there on the top, it's telling me now that one, I'm within range of a good exposure of what's capable with the values that I have in here. So ISO 100 at f2.2. If I start to go out of that range, if I go up to 60, this is where you'll start seeing that I am underexposing my image. It's gonna give you the correlation that you're able to select here. So as I move through, you'll see that the aperture value shifts as well into what the proper correlation for that particular exposure is going to be. So this can be one really powerful tool to be able to quickly tell where your exposure values are. On the bottom of the screen, and actually I can move my camera to show it. So on the bottom of the screen right there, that plus minus 0. What that is indicating is that you are at 0 exposure for your particular setting. So if I go into full manual, you'll see right now I can independently move my shutter speed here. I can bring myself into, say, 60th of a second, and with the ISO values that I've got set at ISO 100, you'll see that I can get, actually let me change this so that it goes to 0. So at 50th of a second at f1.7 at ISO 100, this is saying this is a quote-unquote 0 exposure. As I adjust my aperture value, so go to f2, if I go to f2.2, and then if I go to f2.1, you'll see that I am now underexposed by 1 stop. So that gray window outside of the red is basically telling you what bounds you have to play with within a plus or minus 3 EV setup there. Now, if you're like me and you like to control even the metering functionality within the camera, we offer a couple of different metering modes within the camera. These are pretty rudimentary when you're talking about trying to get the exposure right. So you have multi-metering or evaluative metering. This uses the entire image area. So if you've got a really, really bright specular highlight and a really, really dark shadow, you're going to lose both of them because camera meters are always set to meter for middle gray. They're trying to look at the world as if it's gray. So keep that in mind when you're looking at these different metering modes. We also have the center weighted, which is kind of the more old school way. This is how I typically have my camera set up. That will isolate out the central region and use that for your exposure metering. That means if you have a really bright highlight up in the corner or down in the in any peripheral area within the frame, it's not going to add much weight to that particular part of the image. Then we have Spot Meter, which literally it's pretty self-explanatory. Spot Meter it uses the spot that the blue arrow is on, or blue crosshair is on, to tell you what your exposure should be. And then we also now have the highlight spot metering. Highlight spot metering is a little bit different than the regular spot metering mode. Highlight spot metering is basically a highlight protection metering mode. So you're going to have a much higher contrast in your frame, but this is what you'll shoot if you want to protect your highlights, and then you're going to bring up your shadows in post for still shooting. This does also work in video, but remember that this is only telling you what this value is going to be set to down here. This is what's calibrating where it determines your zeroed exposure should be. Now, further than that, if you're like me, again, I use center weighted metering. We also have a really cool tool within the system here, which is called exposure offset. So we have the ability to also come in here for exposure offset adjustment, and I can come in and say, hey, well, yes, I understand that Panasonic Lumix has rated 0 EV for what we rate our 0 EV at, which all manufacturers have a slight variance in that. But I tend to personally find that I actually like to have the exposures maybe about a third of a stop underexposed. You can come in and actually reprogram what the zero value is for your exposure compensation. Or not exposure, what your zero exposure value is for your exposure meter. So this means I can come in and say, hey, when I am going to be doing a center weighted metering, I always want that meter to be biasing under by negative 1/3 EV. What this allows me to do is not have to think, hey, set it up to 0 EV and then use exposure compensation to dial it back down under by a third because, hey, I tend to like my shots a little more underexposed. You can go in and program this, and this is how you can adjust and say, hey, this is how I want the camera to work with. The thing to keep in mind with exposure offset adjustment is that when you use things like bracketing or exposure bracketing, it ignores what this setting is. That will still be whatever the brand 0 is. That's how your exposure metering is then set for bracketing. When you disable bracketing after that, it goes back to what you've set it at as in the camera for that particular shooting style. Let's see, I saw a whole fury of a bunch of questions come in here. Sorry, I meant re-engineering an L mount to 4/3, not adding a converter. Even that, I don't know if that's something that would ever happen. Because you also run into size. As a good example, I'm trying to find one that would be a good example of this because I don't have any right on my desk. And the closest would be like, okay, so here's the 100 to 400 in micro 4/3. Here's a 60 to 600. Now I know these are not exactly, so please bear with me. I'm not making these an exact comparison, but like as a good example, or as a somewhat relevant example, that's a full frame super telephoto lens. This is an L mount. So you've got a 0.25 millimeter difference between this and the mount that would be on this lens. This lens on a micro 4/3 camera, as it sits, people are already saying that micro 4/3 is too big of a camera. So unless the world decides to change, I don't know if you're going to see stuff like that happen. You also run into other potential challenges there because you'd have to determine, one, can the lens, is the flange back distance able to be built that way? Do teleconverters still work? All of those things have to get kind of brought into the conversation if you're not going to completely redesign a lens for the system. Is there a latitude chart available for the S1H? Been looking for a while. Would be great to know the latitude and highlight and shadow depending on ISO, especially since it's not ISO invariant. No, unfortunately, we don't post something like that. I know what kind of chart you're asking about, but it's not something we've ever published. Native ISO and various ISO thresholds are big topics these days. Has it always been that way, but we weren't aware that it was an issue? Native ISOs, the biggest kind of, it's more of a self-fulfilling topic, because brands like us have openly stated, like, this is what your native ISO values are. And with the advent of logarithmic video recording becoming much more common in the consumer space, it means that it's something that people can latch on to, and you can start discussing more. You can have more conversations about, well, why is it this? Why, does company 1 do it this way? Why does company 2 have it rated this way? What's the difference between the log curves? These are things that have always been done in the cinema side. And realistically, if you go back to film, we did this in film too. If you were shooting a cinematic feature and you had 800 ASA film, that was your native ISO or native ASA, because that's what the film was rated for. Modern digital cameras, because things can be changed electronically, as more video functionality has come into play, that's why there's much larger conversations about it. It also means that there's a lot more misinformation about what various ISO values mean, what the true nature of native ISO is, how it interplays with things like dynamic range and noise. So it turns into a kind of muddy mess of a conversation depending on where you look. The fact of the matter is that in the photography world, you typically would think more of base ISO, which is going to be your lowest ISO range before you go into an extended range. That's going to get you, in a photography sense, the most dynamic range and the cleanest looking image. In the video world, it's a bit different because your cleanest image doesn't always necessarily have the best dynamic range. It's what your bias is changed for. Are you setting the system up for cleaner, but maybe a little less dynamic range, or are you looking for maximum dynamic range, but you'll have maybe a little bit more noise than an adjacent ISO value? Any word when we'll be able to disable recording 4-channel audio? That I have no idea. It's been asked for a lot. I know that I've presented it. I know Matt's presented it. I know our team understands what the request is. Just don't know when you see something like that happen. Kristen says, hey Sean, the percent value shown with Luminance Spot Meter, can you elaborate on that, please? Yes, I can. So, if you've noticed throughout here, now that I am in a Like 709 color profile, the Luminance Spot Meter is actually rating in a percentage value instead of a stop value. The percentage value is a percentage of negative, I think it's like -7 to, let me move this to, move this into a dark region to see what if I can get this to go to the lowest range. So like I have -5 there as my lowest particular range. So I can go -5 to, if I go into a really highlight, bright portion here, up to 80. Realistically, it'll go up to 109%. What the percentage value is telling you is where that particular point is on a -5 to 109 scale. The higher the value, or when you hit 100%, you're at white. When you go to 109, you're at basically super white. In a photography sense, basically, if you're at 109% or below, if you're not pinning it past 109, you've got highlight information that you can pull back. If you are above 0 in the shadowed region, you've got shadow information to pull back. If you're in video, it's kind of the similar thing. In that case, it would be that you would want to set your midtones to 42%, because that'll correlate to about 42% IR or 42 IRE, to get you that general kind of proper exposure for it. It's just a different way because with Vlog in our cameras, everyone always runs based off stops for how much latitude you have. In like 709 and other color profiles, you're just going to consider percentages at that point. So that's what you get there. So Ron says, are we going to get the AF updates of the G9 Mark II into our S5 Mark II? I have 4 S5 IIs not moving to Micro Four Thirds, but it does feel like a slight to your full frame investors. Trust me, the G9 Mark II for Micro Four Thirds shooters are not going to jump to full frame with a powerful camera like the G9, but the S5 II should feel handy. S5 II should feel handicapped. I left Canon and Sony for that very reason. So Ron, the one thing that I will say here is look at the brand histories of firmware update and support on products. I don't think our competitors can hold a candle, for the most part, to what we have done and added through firmware to our cameras over their life cycles. The S5 Mark II and the Mark IIX have already received some major firmware updates over their life cycle. The G9 Mark II is less than a year old, and that is a platform that launched a couple new autofocus performance updates there. There kind of goes back to that firmware update comment that I mentioned much earlier, is that, look, in general, firmware updates will always be tried to be brought to cameras that are hardware capable of it and in a relatively timely manner. Just because a G9 Mark II comes out and it has things like animal eye and car and motorcycle tracking and all that kind of fun stuff, and it's a little bit faster, part of that's thanks to the faster sensor, does not mean that we forget about the other cameras. When we do firmware updates on cameras, we want to make sure that it is released properly. So I can't guarantee that things are ever going to come in firmware updates, but we are not a brand that has a reputation of necessarily, leaving you in the dust when you're in cameras like this. So I understand the frustration, but yeah, we're doing a lot as far as actually improving products over their life cycle. In some cases, it may take longer than I think some people want, which I understand. I want everything as well to just be quickly done in these updates. But having firsthand experience and talking and working with engineers on what it takes to get firmware updates out and make sure that they are reliable, having it done right is definitely a much better way than just kind of slapping a bunch of stuff into there and then hey, you find out it breaks something and then you have to do like what some other companies have done where you have to retract a firmware update. That's a horrible situation that no company ever wants to be in that situation, but it has happened in the industry, and we're not in a place that we would ever want to make that happen with our products. So Al says, just a quick thank you for what you do. Just know it was a factor in me returning to Panasonic Lumix after having left Micro Four Thirds for some time. Thank you so much. That makes me feel so incredible for what we do here. And welcome back. Thank you so much. That's awesome. Let's immediate satisfaction takes too long. That it does. But we do really stand behind the products. It's one of the reasons why we have these broadcasts, is that all of your feedback, your commentary, whether it's, positive commentary, whether it's a criticism of the brand, whether it's something, Ron, like your comments, they're great comments because it is an opinion out in the market. It is a feeling that some people have. We want to know those things. Just because I, can be able to answer some of the things and come back and, hopefully maybe address, your concern there that hey, it is stuff that we do look and we consider. That's why we do this. That's why we are building this community. That's why it's been one of my major goals over the entire time I've been doing this, to expand this community, to help get more people into this so that you all know that you have this platform. And things don't always have to be sunshines and rainbows and all happiness here. You got criticisms of the brand, drop it in the chat, because the only way you get better at the products or the performance that you're doing is by taking in all of the commentary, the good and the bad. So Let's see here. Pete says only Nikon comes close currently with the firmware updates, and they do a great job. Yep, they do. Blackmagic, they've done some pretty good updates too. Yep. There's definitely no reason to not call out, positives, updates in the industry. Updates are always a good thing. But definitely just always keep in mind that not everything that you see as cameras move forward, not everything that gets put into some cameras can be even put into other cameras, because you do also have hardware limitations there. But as a brand, we always try to do as much as we can with the products. Just bought a tiny 12 megapixel GF5 to play with. No firmware updates at normal sites. Is it possible that firmware 1.0 is all there is after all this time? On cameras like the GF line, yeah, it's pretty likely that that's probably the only firmware that came out on a camera like that. When you look at categories of cameras that typically used to be those lines that were updated like every year, firmware updates were a little less common in that category. You would end up finding firmware updates for more the initial concept of what a firmware update was, which was it fixes a bug. Modern cameras, when you start going into like even cameras like G100, and you start going into what the newer world is, that's where companies like us are always trying to say like, hey, is there something we can do to update it? There's not always the case. There are a lot of cases where some cameras there really isn't anything that you can do within the hardware because they were built to basically be as performance as they can be with the hardware that was used at the time. But even more modern cameras, as you start moving further up the scale, higher end cameras will always get better firmware support because there's much higher expectation on those products. Lower tier products typically, they'll get service kind of things. But as far as things like feature improvements or capability additions, those are things that are always really something that's behind what we're trying to push forward with like the S5 series and greater in that category. When we talk full frame, when we talk micro four thirds, it's like G series and higher. An out-of-topic question, but what are your favorite film sims, real-time LUTs for the S5 II or the G9 Mark II, and would it be able for you to share any of them with us? I noticed you had some which aren't default. Yes. So I love old film simulations, like old Kodachrome, the old Fuji looks. I am a massive fan of the Kodachrome look. In fact, my dog was named after Kodachrome, shortened down to Koda. So anytime I can find looks that are, built off of that, I'm 100% down with them. The LUTs that I currently use, unfortunately, I can't post anywhere or share. They are typically... the LUTs that I use are versions of what Ted Forbes, the Art of Photography channel, has in his presets for Lightroom and Capture One. There are ways that you can convert presets to a .cube file. I encourage you to go take a look at some of those. But yeah, there are some other options out there. But in general, when you take a look online, I think the coolest thing about the real-time LUT functionality, and this does kind of tie in with exposure as well, to kind of bring it back to that before I have to wrap today. The coolest thing about that real-time LUT function is that if you edit in, if you throw a photo in Photoshop, and I know not everybody is a big fan of Photoshop. Some people use Affinity or some of the other, I guess Affinity is going to be called Canva, maybe, I don't know, with that whole thing. When you use a program like Photoshop, particularly Photoshop for this example, you can edit your photo within layers. I've done a number of streams on this before. You can edit your photo as layers for different adjustments, make a look for yourself, and then Photoshop will kick that LUT out for you. So if you have a very specific way that you like to work or that you like to edit your photos, try editing it in Photoshop as a layered editing process. Leave those layers visible, and then go into export, and you can export out a color lookup table. And then, as I said, we have a couple LUT videos that we've done on the live stream that kind of talk you through and show you how to do it, what to name it, what precision to set it at, which is 33 points. You can load it in on your camera, and then you can get some really cool, unique looks that are just specific to you. It's a really fun way to shoot with. It's a cool way to actually set and work with your camera if you're someone who likes to, kind of capture what you see is what you get. By using the various different tools that we talked about today. I know there's plenty more, and we only scratched the surface on them. You can use those, set up the cameras that have real-time LUT, be able to capture those images, and then you've just got some awesome out-of-camera results that you send right to your phone, get posted, share to family, friends, all that kind of fun stuff. It's a ball of creativity that you have with these cameras. I've never been more excited about what you can do with colors on our cameras than I have since we introduced real-time LUT. By the way, cranking the focus peaking down to -2 helps with focusing issues I was having with old lenses. That's really good to know. Thank you for updating me on that. Yeah, the focus peaking is going to be one of those things that as camera monitor resolutions change, like the LCD and the EVF, adjusting the coarseness of it. I'm glad that you were able to find something that helps with it. I know it's probably not a perfect solution, but yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for keeping me updated on something like that. And then last one I can take for today, Luke says, I just benchmarked the S5 II against the R7 for wildlife photography. It did so well that I've invested in the Sigma 150 to 600 DGDN. One wish though, please bring back pre-burst. Yeah, I would love to have pre-burst in the cameras. I love using it on my G9 Mark II. Because like with the motorcycle stuff that I shoot, it's nice for those moments where you just happen to not be maybe perfectly on your game, or you're just waiting forever. It's something that we've asked the team about. Is it something that can come to the S5 series, to any of the cameras? And at this point, I just don't have an update for you. I wish I did, but it's definitely noted. I agree with you. I know Matt agrees with you on the pre-burst functionality, but yeah. Let's see here. And DJ, I need that cheaper version of an SL3. Sean, hi also. Yeah. How's it going, DJ? Yeah. So for one, the SL3 is an SL3. That's Leica's camera. I don't know if there's ever anything from us that's going to be in that kind of category. So I wish I did. Y'all know that there's stuff that I know within the company because of what I do for the company that, one, I like keeping my job. I like seeing that comment pop up on different forums, right? I won't tell you things because I like keeping my job. And there's also a lot of stuff that I don't know. Not as much stuff anymore, but yeah, know that we're always constantly evolving the brand. We're always constantly evolving products. We're looking and taking feedback from all of you. Whether it's here, whether it's comments that are made out in things like Facebook, Instagram, even comments on TikTok, which if you haven't already, make sure to go check out the LUMIX USA TikTok. There's been some pretty funny things that we've done over there. We always take all that information into consideration when we're looking at future products. But know that even if I did know stuff, I wouldn't be able to tell you what I know. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for the awesome conversations, the great questions. Hopefully you learned a little bit about some of the tools, the exposure tools that we have within some of the LUMIX cameras. As I mentioned earlier, I know that this is just a tip of the iceberg with this. We didn't even get to things like Zebra functionality, which has a ton of flexibility in these cameras. But I am unfortunately out of time. It's amazing how fast almost an hour and a half goes when we're talking like this. We will be back. I just have to look up scheduling here. We will be back next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern time. So that will be April 4th. So make sure to tune in then. We'll have the topic posted and everything, hopefully sooner than I was able to get it up today. And then just some programming notes for the rest of April. April 11th is going to be a pre-recorded stream because we will be out at NAB. So unfortunately, I won't be able to do that one live. The following week on the 18th will be a live stream again. So we will be back. Actually, no, the following one will also be recorded. So Actually, yes, looking at the calendar, April 4th will be the only actual live broadcast that we'll be doing throughout April. The 11th, 18th, and 25th are all going to be pre-recorded streams because we have NAB, which takes up 2 weeks of our time. And then I have another event that I'm working, unfortunately, that will also be taking up time on the 25th. So next week will be the only live stream. Sorry for that confusion. Other than that, if you have questions, if you have topics that you want to see us cover in the future, make sure to leave those as a comment after this video is posted. So leave it down in the comment field after this. It helps us be able to kind of update and get you guys some just general better information as we move forward. It helps me, kind of create newer topics, newer streams to kind of cover there. So be sure to check out what we've got going on in the future. I totally lost my train of thought here as I'm reading through some of the comments here. Yeah, other than that, everybody, I look forward to coming back live next Thursday at 2 p.m. If you're going to be out at NAB, definitely come by, swing by the booth, chat with Matt, myself, or Neil. We will be there. It's going to be a fun show. I always like NAB, especially because at least the last couple years, I've seen a number of you there. So swing by. This is probably the longest wrap-up I've done. So other than that, thanks everybody. I hope you have an awesome rest of your day. I hope you have a great weekend. And if you like this video, hit the like button. It helps me out tremendously. If you don't already subscribe, although I know we have a pretty high rate of subscribers that tune in for this. If you know people that may be finding benefit in these, share them the video. Sharing these videos helps us out tremendously as well. Other than that, talk to you all next week, Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Later.